Good evening. The worst air crash in American history took place today. An American Airlines DC-10 with 279 people aboard lost power during a takeoff from Chicago's O'Hare International Airport. It plunged 2,000 feet to the ground and everyone was killed. 3 on the ground were slightly injured. O'Hare, filled with holiday travelers, was closed briefly. It was American Airlines Flight 191 bound for Los Angeles. The airline says an engine malfunctioned on takeoff. Witnesses said the engine fell off. 279 dead, a great tragedy. Fred Briggs reports.
This was all that was left of American Airlines Flight 191. At 10 minutes after 3 Chicago time, the DC-10, bound for Los Angeles, took off from Chicago's O'Hare International Airport from runway 14 right in a northwesterly direction. After leaving the runway, the jumbo jet rolled steeply to the left, according to some witnesses, almost belly up, then plunged straight to the ground where it exploded. One witness said he thought he saw fuel being dumped from the left wing during the takeoff, but apparently one engine literally fell off the airplane. There were 279 aboard that flight, passengers and crew. None survived. Here's how another eyewitness described it.
We saw the American Airlines, and we looked up and we thought, you know, it's really low. And the next thing we know, we saw this silver cylinder thing had fallen off. Did not see the actual break, you know, from the thing, but next thing we knew, there was this cylinder thing that had hit the ground on the runway and seemed to have rolled onto the side and was first burst into flames and then started to smother. And we were really, you know, scared that nobody had realized that this had happened while the plane was, was taking off.
The crash site is just half a mile from runway 14 right and just 200 feet from a large trailer park. Had the plane not veered left, the crash could have killed residents of that park, which probably occurred to the pilot when he maneuvered the plane. As it is, it hit an old hangar near the airport boundary that was used for storing aircraft parts. The smoke from the crash was visible 15 miles away in downtown Chicago. The weather here was clear, but quite windy with strong gusts. Firemen arrived within minutes to do what they could to extinguish the flames. The DC-10 had full tanks, perhaps 100,000 pounds of fuel on board to make the 2,000-mile run to the West Coast, so there were a lot of flames to put out. There were many flags planted, too, where bodies were found. Not all of them yet, but it seems certain no one lived through this, the nation's worst air disaster. Fred Briggs, NBC News, Chicago.
Today's crash was bigger than the San Diego collision last year, which killed 144. The worst air accident ever took 582 lives when 2 747s collided on the runway in the Canary Islands. NBC News will have a special report on today's crash at 11:30 this evening Eastern Time.
Good evening. 270 persons were killed this afternoon when an American Airlines jumbo jet crashed just minutes after takeoff from Chicago's O'Hare Airport. It was the worst U.S. air disaster, almost doubling the toll from a Pacific Southwest Airlines crash in San Diego exactly 8 months ago. The DC-10, Flight 191, was bound nonstop to Los Angeles. According to witnesses, the plane lost an engine just moments after takeoff. An American Airlines spokesman said preliminary investigation indicated the left engine malfunctioned. Witnesses said the engine dropped to the ground and exploded into flames as the plane began to roll over in the air. It crashed belly up. Much of the debris fell on some trailer parks near the runway's edge at Elk Grove Township. Some injuries were reported there. Area hospitals had been alerted to receive casualties, but later were told to cancel the alert. There were no survivors. All 270 persons aboard were killed. O'Hare, the nation's busiest airport, was shut down briefly, but some runways later reopened. Departing flights were delayed up to an hour. An eyewitness described the crash.
I talked to the FAA, and they said that the one engine was laying back on the runway. He evidently lost it right on takeoff, and he was trying to correct the problem as he came over Touhy Avenue here. But then when the hydraulic system went out and the other engine died, he just lost it completely and crashed over here.
So the plane actually came down perpendicular to the ground?
Right. The left wing dug a path, and as soon as it collapsed and it hit the ground, the spark set off the jet fuel, and this whole place was nothing but a sheet of flame.
Thank you.
CBS News will present a special broadcast on the air crash tonight at 11:30, 10:30 Central Time.
The O'Hare Airport Control Tower gave routine clearance to an American jetliner, Flight 191, bound for Los Angeles. Then at takeoff, an incredible sight to the aircraft tower controllers, the port or left engine on the giant DC-10 suddenly fell off, cartwheeling to the runway below. What happened then is a thing that nightmares are made of. Tower observers and eyewitnesses on the ground giving me a composite report that the plane seemed to hesitate, then make some sort of a zigzag maneuver, begin to climb again, then to side slip to the left. Moments later, as seen from the Channel 9 helicopter, the plane smashed into a field just north of the airport runway. The nose and the left wing apparently hit first. A gas station attendant, standing less than 100 yards away, told me that the plane apparently began to flip over on impact, but instead of cartwheeling, there were multiple explosions, and the silver plane suddenly became a surrealistic picture, etched, as he said, in orange and black. Policemen who were training canine unit dogs right next to the field told me they thought they were about to be killed. The impact and the fire were so intense. They said they had no warning at all, but they're so used to low-flying jets almost at the end of the runway that they paid no attention to the noise until the plane, as one policeman said, suddenly filled his whole horizon. An all-points emergency plan was put into effect. It involved fire, police, and ambulance units from a dozen surrounding towns. At one point, there were some 3 dozen ambulances and 300 to 400 police and fire units at the scene. But the disaster plan was a useless effort. There were simply no survivors. 257 passengers, a 13-person working crew, and 2 other airline employees returning to their California base all died. At least that is the last count we get. There has been a lot of confusion on the numbers. While ambulance and the fire rescue crews searched, in vain it appeared, for survivors, other fire units had their hands full trying to prevent the fire from spreading through an adjacent trailer park. As it would turn out, there was damage to a handful of the trailers, and people in the area would be injured, but none of them serious. 2 were admitted to hospitals with burns. One trailer resident, however, told me he escaped death by inches. He said a 3-foot piece of metal from the plane shot through the window of his trailer as he sat watching television. In the field, there was no sharp delineation, however. A huge black crater marked the apparent center of the impact area, a blackened engine, a wing section. Those were the only indications that what we saw here had ever been an airplane. Federal Aviation spokesman Neil Callahan told News 9 reporter Don Harris that the towers saw a problem just before takeoff, called the pilot saying, "Do you want to return?" There was no answer from the cockpit. From this wreckage, National Transportation Safety Board investigators have retrieved the so-called black boxes, recorders for cockpit conversation, and for continuous readout of all the electronics that indicate such things as engine function, altitude of the plane itself, fuel, and a score of essential guidance system reports. Those units, we understand, are now on their way to Washington, D.C., where they will be decoded, a rather complex procedure, where the mystery of exactly what caused American Flight 191 to crash. About a mile from the crash site, in a hangar, officials have set up a morgue. The bodies, put in yellow and white bags, are being transferred there as the long, nearly impossible task of identification begins. Investigators say they have to rely on watch and jewelry descriptions and inscriptions, the few documents that are intact, and other personal possessions to help in the identification. Mayor Jane Byrne was on hand at the crash site. From this crash, there is no hope of simple recognition.
American flies several DC-10s in and out of DFW. One will land here tomorrow. Some consumer groups say for safety, all the planes should be grounded. But the Airline Passengers Association, based in Dallas, isn't going quite that far. The group is asking the government to immediately ground one of the planes and check it for design faults.
We're asking that the government take a DC-10 or a representative number of DC-10s and test that airplane, number one, for metal fatigue, and possibly also design.
Hal Salfin says often a hairline crack won't show up in routine inspections. He's not questioning the quality of American's maintenance program or the safety of the DC-10, but he does think a scientific test would reassure passengers by showing whether the accident in Chicago was a freak or whether other planes might have similar problems. But FAA investigators are questioning just how an engine could fall off of a well-maintained plane. It may take them several months to find an answer. They do know what happened. The plane crashed when the engine fell because the sudden weight loss caused it to cartwheel in midair. The Passengers Association has sent telegrams to the FAA, the CAB, and the National Transportation Safety Board asking them to begin a test of another DC-10 immediately. Selfin hopes to get an answer tonight. Karen Parfit, the Texas News.
The crash of an American Airlines DC-10 in Chicago last Friday was blamed on a faulty bolt in the left-wing engine. The bolt failed because of metal fatigue. The result? America's worst air tragedy. Only one DC-10 flies regularly into DFW Airport, an American Airlines flight which arrives in the middle of the night. Bill Crosby, Vice President of American Airlines Southern Division, explains the Federal Aviation Administration's inspection order.
The FAA directive is to have all DC-10 engine-mounted bolts inspected by midnight tonight, or the airplanes will have to be grounded.
Before the directive had been issued, American Airlines had begun inspecting and replacing the engine bolts. Crosby says none of the bolts have proved defective, but all have been replaced as a precaution.
We have inspected every one of the bolts, and we've x-rayed them, and we've found no deficiencies up to this point.
By this evening, all of American's DC-10s will again be in routine operation. Friday's plane crash doesn't appear to have resulted in any reduction in reservations. Holiday travelers crowded DFW Airport this afternoon, no different from any other Memorial Day. This is David Finfrock, the Texas News.
Despite the fact that the safety board said American was guilty of improper and abusive maintenance, American officials have been very quiet about the ruling. What little the airline would say was in a short statement that came out this afternoon. In it, American said at least half of the blame for the crash should go to McDonnell Douglas, the people who built the plane. The Transportation Safety Board noted that the pylon could be damaged during normal maintenance, and American argues that was at least as responsible for the crash as American's maintenance procedures. But American insisted on removing the engine and pylon in one piece, despite McDonnell's recommendation that it be done separately. People inside American Airlines say McDonnell Douglas never told them not to do it in one piece, even though the company was aware that American and Continental Airlines weren't following the maintenance recommendation. McDonnell admits that it knew American wasn't following the recommended procedure, but when pressed further, all its spokesman would say was that maintenance is the responsibility of the airline. His company had done its part. While all this catcalling goes on, the safety board wants changes to make sure that somebody is responsible. The board wants the airlines to make a report on the hazards of any maintenance that doesn't follow the manufacturer's recommendations, and that maintenance would have to get FAA approval. The safety board also wants a better definition of exactly what a major and minor repair really is. And the board wants better reporting of damage to structurally important parts of the aircraft by both the airlines and the FAA. American Airlines, McDonnell Douglas, and the FAA all say they did their jobs. The safety board says that's not the case, and that the 271 victims prove its point. Ed Martell, Channel 5 Action News, DFW. The National Transportation Safety Board lays the whole thing at American's door. Not surprisingly, American disagrees. It says McDonnell Douglas, the people who build DC-10s, are at least as much to blame as the airline. But there is more to the Safety Board report than blame. The board's investigators spent much of the year trying to find out not only what happened, but how to prevent it from happening again. That's why the board is recommending reports on any maintenance procedure that doesn't come from the manufacturer. The board also wants the FAA and the airlines to explain exactly what they mean by a major and minor repair, and it wants them reported better. Since May, American and other airlines have made some changes. American has made additions to its flight training course to handle the kind of situation that cropped up in Chicago, and the airline has revised flight procedures. The company has modified the DC-10s it has and increased its inspections of those airplanes. And American has also changed its maintenance procedures, perhaps with a nod to the $500,000 fine it received earlier for the unapproved maintenance it was performing on its DC-10s. But American isn't out of the woods yet. Because of today's placing of blame, it is now open season on the airline by anyone with a damage claim from the crash. Ed Martell, Channel 5 Action News, DFW. The Airline Passengers Association says that American shouldn't be taking all the blame for what happened in Chicago last May. As a matter of fact, the APA feels that American probably did more than anyone else to try to avoid what happened in Chicago. Make a pretty good case.
We're convinced that the buck stops there, and it starts there. From what we know of the FAA and their charter, they really have three real functions, and one is surveillance over maintenance, surveillance over design, approval of design, surveillance over full safety, and even the operational procedures of the aircraft.
The argument goes that if the FAA isn't doing its job, then the airlines can't even begin to do theirs. And Pylon stands by American's effort to do that job to keep its machinery safe.
They've been the first to try to fix the aircraft, number one. And number two, they have a tremendous maintenance base here that is approved as even being able to make structural changes. But the FAA still has a surveillance obligation over those structural changes and over watching how that aircraft is done and sharing information between other carriers.
That, according to the APA, is probably the most serious error the FAA made. Besides not testing to see what might happen if the engine ripped off to the front, besides not approving the maintenance that American was doing, the FAA didn't bother to tell American when cracks and structural problems started cropping up at other airlines. With everything that happened, the Passengers Association feels the FAA didn't do its job at any of the steps along the way. Just how far is the APA willing to push that belief? All the way. It's already spent over $400,000 on a federal court suit to prove that the FAA was responsible for that crash that killed 273 people. Pylon is convinced the FAA could have prevented that accident any number of times before it happened. Ed Martell, Channel 5 Action News, DFW. The Federal Aviation Administration is supposed to be responsible for all the parts of American aviation safety, from design of aircraft to inspection of the craft after they're built. Jim Pylon, the managing director of the Airline Passenger Association, says the FAA didn't do its job in a number of areas.
In our opinion, it is the FAA where the buck stops on all of this. They have to approve the design, the maintenance, and the operation of the aircraft.
Pylon defends American's efforts to keep the DC-10 safe and says American got no help from the feds.
Problems that occurred with other carriers in cracking this particular part of the aircraft, which ultimately created the major problem, had occurred before, but the information had not been properly disseminated.
And if that was simple oversight, the FAA also missed the big ones, like anticipating what happened in Chicago.
Condition was never tested, so what the crew had done was according to the books, from what I have read in the NTSB report. But the operational procedure had not been written, or at least disseminated, from what I can see, on what to do had this particular engine separation occurred. So they did what was right, but exactly what was wrong.
And to prove it's willing to put its money where its mouth is, the airline
Good evening. The experts have decided it wasn't just the suspect bolt that caused this country's worst air crash last Friday. They have found what they called grave and potentially dangerous deficiencies in the DC-10 engine mounts. So today, the Federal Aviation Administration grounded all 134 DC-10s operated by U.S. Airlines, the first grounding of an entire jetliner fleet in the nation's history. Richard Roth reports from Washington.
Today's directive, immediately grounding all U.S.-operated DC-10s, came as a result of inspections ordered by the Federal Aviation Administration yesterday. Inspections that FAA Administrator Langhorne Bond said turned up bigger problems.
These inspections are turning up grave and potentially dangerous deficiencies in many of the pylon mountings now being checked as a result of that order. These problems are not just with the bolts, but also in other areas of the assembly that holds DC-10 engines to the wings. The whole fleet is going to be down immediately. How long it stays down is another matter.
Before a DC-10 can resume flight, the order requires a complete inspection of all points linking the plane's 9,000-pound engines with its wings, not just bushings and bolts like those implicated in the Chicago crash, which attach the engine pylon or support to the underside of the wing. In addition to grounding DC-10s, the government order requires the inspection, but not grounding, of all Boeing 747 and Lockheed 1011 wide-body aircraft. Bond said engineers were not certain what caused the deficiencies in engine mountings, which he said apparently include metal fatigue, parts that cracked or weakened prematurely. But he implied that some aspects of the FAA's certification process, which all aircraft undergo before approval for flight, and which in the case of the DC-10 has been criticized by the Airline Pilots Association and by Ralph Nader, may have been at fault.
There's no question somewhere along the way that we didn't do it right.
James King of the National Transportation Safety Board, in charge of investigating the Chicago crash, told reporter Charles Gomez today's FAA order raises new concerns.
This time we're almost experimenting on what the maintenance and inspection process should be for the DC-10, and now we find ourselves trying to construct a set of maintenance and corrective action following a catastrophic accident.
FAA Administrator Bond said he hoped the order would not disrupt air traffic, but added if that is necessary, that will be the case. In fact, among the first passengers affected was a safety board official bringing metal samples from the Chicago crash here for analysis. Because of the DC-10 groundings, his flight was delayed. Richard Roth, CBS News, Washington.
The cancellation or the grounding of the DC-10 has forced cancellation, of course, of some flights. Some airline officials urge the passengers holding tickets for DC-10 flights check with airline information. We have two reports on the effects of the day's developments, beginning with Mitchell Krause in New York.
United Airlines, just over a strike, had grounded its DC-10 fleet even before the FAA order. In Minneapolis, Northwest Airlines is scrambling to find other planes while the DC-10 inspection goes forward. American Airlines is in the same boat. The other U.S. carriers with DC-10s, Western, Continental, National, are combining flights using alternate aircraft or canceling flights altogether. But the 8th U.S. carrier, World Airways, which started regularly scheduled budget fare flights just 6 weeks ago, says it will continue to fly its 6 DC-10s because it believes it's complying with the FAA order. Foreign airlines are not bound by the FAA grounding order. Not all are complying. But Lufthansa says it's grounded all its DC-10 flights, including today's New York to Lima flight with 146 passengers booked, some of whom have been delayed for 2 days because of an earlier FAA-ordered inspection. All British airlines have also grounded their DC-10s on British government orders. The Japanese have done the same. Further adding to the day's confusion was the FAA inclusion of the European-made A300 Airbus flown by Eastern Airlines. But Eastern has now been advised that the A300's pylon is so different from the DC-10s that it won't be grounded, but will receive the same special inspection review ordered by the FAA for all wide-bodied aircraft operating in the U.S. Mitchell Krause, CBS News, New York.
The order to ground the aircraft came so fast it left bewilderment and confusion at Chicago's O'Hare Field. At American Airlines, passengers boarded several DC-10s and then sat more than an hour before being taken off the grounded planes. At United, instead of boarding, passengers could look through the glass and see mechanics examining the bolts on their DC-10, hardly an encouraging sign. Then came the announcement.
For those of you that are not aware of it, the FAA has grounded all DC-10s.
Others preferred inconvenience to flying on a plane which was suspect in any way.
I mean, I've been here since 10 o'clock this morning. I paid $154 for a one-way ticket to Phoenix, and this is what you get. I just can't believe it.
I'd much rather be grounded than to take off and get myself killed or something.
At some counters, ticket agents had trouble controlling unhappy passengers.
Front, you're all on. Now, folks, hold on. Hold on right here. Okay. Who's pushing over here? Just hold on a second, folks.
There were 9 DC-10s at O'Hare when the grounding order came, and in the afternoon, others arrived. They had been in the air when the directive was issued. One of the last DC-10s to arrive was American 630 from Phoenix. It landed at 1:31 p.m. Had the grounding order not been issued, it would have refueled and continued on to Los Angeles as American 191. Don Webster, CBS News, Chicago.
It's not certain how long the DC-10 grounding will last because the airlines say they have not been informed what the inspection process should consist of. Besides the 3 foreign airlines Krauss mentioned, 3 others, Laker, Alitalia, and Swiss Air, have grounded their DC-10s. 27 other foreign airlines say they're inspecting theirs but haven't yet grounded them. In Chicago today, the first lawsuit was filed in connection with the American Airlines crash. The wife and son of an Austrian are asking almost $16 million from the airline and 2 manufacturers. But as Terry Drinkwater reports from Los Angeles, there are other indications of troubled financial skies for the firm that makes the DC-10s.
Since the first DC-10 was rolled out of the McDonnell Douglas hangars here in 1970, there had been no changes in the design of the pylons which hold the engines to the wings. The new jets now being built will be modified as soon as authorities learn precisely what the structural defect is. The company now has firm orders for 50 additional DC-10s, with 50 more conditional orders. Some of those options to buy may not be exercised by the airlines if the grounding lasts long and if passengers continue to wonder about the safety of the plane. Nearly 15,000 work on the DC-10. Among them, there is deep concern, mostly because they too don't yet know what went wrong with the planes. Meanwhile, the FAA is characterizing the problems with the DC-10 as grave and potentially dangerous, created a public relations nightmare for company executives.
We don't really know what the impact is going to be on McDonnell Douglas or on the traveling public, except that the DC-10 is a very busy airplane.
Indeed, so busy that 240 million people have ridden on them. In recent years, the DC-10 has become the mainstay of the company's commercial plane division, though government military contracts account for nearly 3/4 of McDonnell Douglas's total income. Today, on the exchanges, the company's stock was down nearly 3 points from Friday. A protracted grounding will hurt some airlines more than others. Continental, for example, which relies on the DC-10s for most all of their flights from Los Angeles to Chicago and Honolulu. Terry Drinkwater, CBS News, Los Angeles.
If I had all the information in hand that we have now, based on almost 2 weeks of investigation, we would not have done it the same way. We act on the facts as we know them at the time, and that's all we can act on.
Grounding the planes has left passengers frustrated and airline personnel overworked. Still, most people at Los Angeles International Airport were able to find alternative flights.
We had one flight we booked already. We're trying to locate other airlines to get you on. Are there any other?
United Airlines, with the most DC-10s, rerouted 15,000 passengers today. At Chicago's O'Hare Airport, United set up a special desk to help its customers. And at Newark Airport, at least one United ticket agent suggested the train as an alternative.
The DC-10s in the British Caledonian fleet are all almost new. They cost over £19 million each, and every hour the controls lie idle costs the airline thousands of pounds. The empty seats on the 3 aircraft would normally be filled with lucrative scheduled airline passengers. The airline, along with other DC-10 operators from Europe, is in Washington at the moment, arguing against the groundings. British Caledonian Chairman Adam Thompson has described the behavior of the American Federal Aviation Administration as amateur and emotional. The critical difference between the American Airlines jets on which the cracks were found and most European DC-10s is range. The Americans are short-haul Series 10s. They land more frequently and suffer more stress than long-haul Series 13s favoured by the Europeans. McDonnell Douglas, their builders, also criticized the FAA.
Today's FAA action is more sweeping and drastic than circumstances warrant because pylon aft bulkhead cracks found during inspection have all been on DC-10 Series 10 aircraft.
Laker's problem has a very human face. Passengers running out of money, unable to get home, or holidays ruined. Some accepted refunds, others wanted seats on scheduled flights. But could they afford it?
Running low on funds. Our flight isn't until Saturday. We have enough of money to do us until Saturday, but that's it.
You must obviously then think you're in a pretty serious situation.
We are.
While frantic efforts were being made to find replacement aircraft, Laker's staff were kept busy contacting passengers, trying to reassure them about their holidays and their flights. Although Laker's DC-10s are grounded until next Wednesday, they are now hoping the authorities will lift the ban so that the big jets can take off again by the weekend.
Nothing has happened that's different. They just found some more cracks in the same place in the same people's aeroplanes. I am saying, and you know, I regret to have to say this, that the experts have been panicked. And they panicked into this decision.
I thought more than twice, but it's a matter of money also, you know. So otherwise I have to take a regular plane and finish my vacation, so I have no more money, so I'm taking a risk.
I think that there's been a great deal of ill-informed official speculation, and I regret it very much. Officially, the Federal Aviation Authority in the United States have declared that that broken bolt was not the cause of the accident. Well, it should never have been declared that it might have been in the first place. Also, there was a threat to ground the Airbus A300 series of aeroplanes, and then that was withdrawn. Now, too much has been said too early. The right thing to do is to get to the completion of the investigation of this accident and then carry out the fix that will be required.
The airline's confidence comes after 5 harrowing and expensive days. The inspections of engine pylons and wings have been exhaustive, but they've found no hint of metal fatigue or structural failure. Laker and British Caledonian believe it's because their long-haul planes make up to 2/3 fewer takeoffs than the medium-haul American DC-10s. Stress is therefore considerably less. Both airlines, though, will, like others, now minutely examine this wing and pylon section, once every 100 hours or 10 days. It's far more frequently than ever before.
We don't believe, we've no reason to believe at the moment that anything more is necessary, because our experts are satisfied that these inspections will reveal any potential danger before it gets beyond the potential stage and before it begins to grow towards real hazard. In other words, we shall see it coming long before it gets to the dangerous stage, and then we would ground the aircraft, of course.
Ticket sales today were normal. Controversial overnight advice from a senior American safety official not to fly DC-10 appeared to have no effect, but British Airlines were today being openly angry at American officials for creating what the British called hysteria by their often unfounded speculation into the cause of the disaster. It was, said British Caledonian, alarming and irresponsible. Nick Gowing, News at 10, Gatwick Airport.
Mr. Newman, clearly services, scheduled services around the world and services like SkyTrain will be heavily disrupted. But what is the outlook for people who've booked package holidays from Britain?
The situation is obviously going to be difficult, and that fact cannot be disguised. However, the industry in the moment is a responsible and fairly strong one, and I would anticipate that much of the capacity would be fulfilled by other operators in the United Kingdom and Europe who will offer additional capacity on sub-charter. Similarly, it is anticipated that the tour operators themselves will consolidate their seats to fill empty ones, and naturally one would have expected that they would have put an embargo on bookings, at least on a temporary basis, with immediate effect.
Does the DC-10 figure prominently in the package holiday market?
You're talking about the United Kingdom and
Yes.
Europe, of course. Well, in fact, in the United Kingdom, it isn't very significant. Europe maybe just a little more so, but it is really essentially a long-haul scheduled service airline as far as the UK operators are concerned.
So you're saying that there are other aircraft available, but some package holidaymakers are going to be disappointed?
There will be difficulties. They will be, I would imagine, required to change their schedules, maybe even their destinations. I don't think the industry would make them be disappointed. It's pretty sophisticated and responsible industry now, you know.
Well, on that point, British Caledonian alleges this morning that some operators are trying, as they say, to make a killing out of the shortage of seats. Is this true?
Well, there is a supply and demand factor in the industry, as there is in any industry, but I think a far more telling problem is the fact that all aircraft operators, regardless of this situation, are at present having to up their prices because they're faced with mammoth fuel price increases currently.
So the edges could get a bit blurred as to what is actually responsible for the price rise.
Indeed so, yes.
Mr. Newman, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
The first DC-10 off the ground today was a Laker plane purely on a test flight. After 2 weeks in the hangar, Laker were wasting no time in getting their fleet of 6 DC-10s airborne again. British Caledonian, however, ran into trouble with their plan to send a DC-10 on its usual route to Lagos. The Nigerians, whose DC-10s have also been grounded for the past 2 weeks, simply didn't reply when Caledonian asked to land the plane in Lagos. So it was a Boeing once again going to West Africa, not a DC-10. There was no shortage of takers for the first DC-10 leaving Britain. Laker's flight to Heraklion in Crete had nearly 300 on board. Any worries for those holidaymakers about flying in a DC-10?
Well, we were a little bit worried, but we rather think that everything's been checked over very carefully, you know, and we're not really bothered.
No problem. If the crew are quite happy to go, we are. I'm just pleased that we're getting off on a holiday.
But doesn't it bother you slightly that the Americans say the plane still isn't safe?
No, well, I mean, you listen to all the newsreel and the publicity about it. I mean, it seems to be a slightly different type of aircraft and different types of landing to what these have been used to. And if they're quite happy, you know, the crew, why should we bother too much? It's a quick way to go anyway, isn't it? You've got to go.
Joining the passengers was Geoffrey Schufo, the safety expert of the Aviation Authority and the man responsible for lifting the ban. We went with him for a first-hand look from the passenger seat at a plane Mr. Schufo says is safe, but which the Americans are refusing to let back into the air. David Smith, News at 10, on a Laker DC-10 for Crete.
We arrived